I'm Lisa Shepard, and I am the Executive Director of the Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism. The mission of the CJCP is to enhance professionalism among North Carolina lawyers, judges, and law students, a mission which it has been doing since 1998. One of the ways that the CJCP does this is to sponsor this historical video series, which is a collection of video interviews of distinguished lawyers, judges, and professionals from across North Carolina. The CJCP began filming these video interviews in 2000 as a means to preserve the thoughts of these bar leaders on the legal profession and on professionalism issues. All of the videos in this series are available to you on the CJCP website and the CJCP's dedicated YouTube channel. We are so fortunate to have had many distinguished members of the North Carolina Bar over the years, and they have much accumulated wisdom to share with us. It is important to understand that the practice of law is a profession, and doing it well requires not only substantive knowledge that one gains in law school and from studying for the bar exam, but also the value of experience learned from other lawyers. I hope that this video series will give you not only a fresh insight into the person being interviewed, but also some meaningful information about how to be a better lawyer in your own practice. Enjoy, and remember, esse quam videre. Strive to be professional in all that you do, rather than to merely seem so.
Welcome to the North Carolina Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism's historical video series. This is a special edition today. We're in the North Carolina Supreme Court building, and we're actually in the Legal History Center. We're going to be talking today and learning about the Charles Blanchard Historical Collection. And in order to do that, you're going to have the privilege of hearing from Danny Moody. Danny is the Chief of Protocol and Historian for the North Carolina Supreme Court. He's been the Executive Director of the North Carolina Supreme Court Historical Society since its inception in 1991. Danny will be interviewed by Wade Smith, a prominent North Carolina lawyer of the Raleigh law firm of Tharrington and Smith. And so I think you will enjoy the interview. I hope you will learn more about the North Carolina Supreme Court and its Historical Society. Thank you for being here.
Danny, it's great to be with you today in what must be one of the most interesting rooms in the city of Raleigh. Of all the museums we have, great history museums and natural science museums and the art museum, this room is absolutely fascinating, especially for people who are lawyers or law students or judges, historians, people who are interested in the legal history of North Carolina. So thank you for taking us on a tour.
Glad
today.
to have you here, Wade.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I've seen a little of the room already, and I know we won't be able to cover it all today, but there are certainly a number of things that I just have to ask you about.
Sure.
And I must begin with this wonderful bookcase. And could you tell us about this bookcase and about its contents?
This case contains what remains of the library of Justice James Iredell, who served on the United States Supreme Court and was appointed by President Washington. He died in 1779, and all of these books, of course, were printed prior to that year. About 80% of the books contain his signature, and this is the largest collection of an 18th century Supreme Court justice in existence. They were inherited by his son, Governor Iredell, and then after the death of Governor Iredell, they were sold at auction. Colonel John W. Hinsdale of the Dodd-Hinsdale House here in Raleigh bought, and they wound up down in Moore County. And they spent about 70 years of their life in wooden barrels and boxes in a barn in Moore County. And they were found, and the fellow who found them realized what they were, thankfully. And he called us, and they were brought here, and spent about 12 years here, and then we had them restored. And as you can see, the restorationists did a wonderful job with them. And all of these books, with the exception of two, are English. They're English treatises, reports, case law, this thing, that, and the other. The 2 volumes were United States laws that were passed while he was a member of the High Court. This volume is the oldest volume in the collection, 1676, and we did not have this restored because it would take sort of a page-by-page restoration.
Can you show us what
Sure.
the book actually looks like?
This was what all of them look like, or probably a little worse. Varmints had gotten to them and other things. But we just decided to leave this one as it was, and it's got its own little box here. So,
What a remarkable collection, and extraordinarily valuable to not only the people of North Carolina, I assume, but to the whole country because of the age of the
well, it is. The folks in D.C. think they deserve these books, but they're not going to get them.
Well,
We're
let's
going to keep them right
Let's keep them
here.
in North Carolina.
And this is an 18th century case, so the books feel right at home.
They are at home.
Here in this.
Well,
and we were very proud of this, that we were able to, number one, save the books, and then number two, have them restored, and display them here for anybody who wants to come in.
It's a marvelous collection. Now, we have a painting of James Iredell
Yes.
in our collection, don't we?
Here to the left, this is Justice James Iredell. Said he was appointed by President Washington. He died in 1799. Justice Iredell's dissent in Chisholm, Georgia, led to the adoption of our 11th Amendment to the Constitution.
Yes,
We're
yes.
very proud that we can call him our own. He was also a customs collector for the Crown in Edenton, and in the collection of books here we have his customs book, which showed him what to charge for what merchandise coming into the port. He was a very distinguished jurist, and he was appointed to the High Court because of his influence here in North Carolina adopting the Constitution.
Would this be our most valuable portrait, or are there others equally valuable?
There are others equally as valuable as this. This was presented along with Justice Moore by the Daughters of the American Revolution. But we're very proud of it.
Now, tell us about these volumes.
These volumes came to us very recently, in the last 3 years. They also belong to Justice Iredell. This is a case of English reports. This is a Bible, New Testament, that was given to Justice Iredell by his grandfather, and it's dated 1716. And this copy here is a book that belonged to Hannah Iredell, which was Justice Iredell's wife, a sister of Samuel Johnston. And it's very unusual for an 18th century woman to have her own books. But this actually has her signature in them.
Yes.
And coming from the family that she did, it was,
Yes.
She would have had books and been educated.
Let's move over to some other paintings. I was going to ask you about this painting of Alfred Moore.
This painting of Justice Moore, he was the second and one of only 2 men from North Carolina ever to serve on the High Court. It was presented to the court by the Daughters of the American Revolution as well. Justice Moore was appointed by President Adams, and he has the distinction of being the shortest man ever to serve on the United States Supreme Court.
Well, should I ask you how tall he was?
He was about 4 feet 11.
Amazing. All right.
And he served a very short period of time on the court. Actually, he was on the court when the Marbury decision was decided. He did not participate because he was sick here in Raleigh. He owned plantations down in Onslow, Pender County, in that area, and he came back home.
Well, small of stature, but great of brain,
Yes,
obviously.
very much so.
Danny, how about the paintings on this wall? Very interesting paintings.
Yes, this is William Horn Battle. Justice Battle served here on this court for 2 different occasions. He also founded the University of North Carolina Law School at Chapel Hill. His father, Kent Battle, was the president of the university. Very, very distinguished law family. They've produced university presidents, attorneys, judges, doctors, I mean, you name it, and it was from Edgecombe County, very distinguished family. The next painting here is Bartholomew Moore, who is a very distinguished attorney from here in Wake County. He had a very, very lucrative practice here in Wake County and was considered the dean of the North Carolina Bar during his day. He was called upon to argue cases here for other attorneys. As you can tell by the amount of gold in this frame, he was not a pauper.
But he was not a judge.
No, he was not a judge. We have lawyers represented here in the portrait collection at the court, and he's just one of them.
I didn't realize that you had lawyers' portraits in the collection. Are there a lot of lawyer portraits in the collection of portraits here at the court?
We have quite a few. It was a practice up until probably the end of the first quarter of the 20th century for prominent attorneys to present their portraits here. Upon the death of the attorney, their families presented them. And that's how the court got this portrait, as well as some others who are upstairs.
Now, there's a third painting.
This painting on the end is Justice William Blunt Rodman. He is part of the Blunt Rodman family from eastern North Carolina, probably the most prominent family in the eastern part of the state. He served one term here on the court, 8 years. He was very instrumental in adopting the Constitution of 1868, as well as he and two other gentlemen developed the code after 1868. Very, very distinguished jurist here, and very fine painting. It's one of the finer paintings.
He had a grandson who served on the court, didn't he?
Yes, by the same name.
Yes.
Both Justice Rodman served here. Justice Rodman Jr. served 2.5 terms, I think it was, here. And this is the only grandson and grandfather team that we've had. We've had 3 father and son teams here, but that was the only grandfather and grandson.
May I ask you about a chair over
Sure.
on this side of the wall? This is a very interesting artifact, and can you tell us a little about it?
This chair was a chair used by the Chief Justice of the court in the conference room of the court from 1914 until 1972. And the reason we know it was the Chief Justice's chair is because of this number 1 here on the back of it. Number 1 indicates the chief here in this building, and this chair was used by every Chief Justice from Walter Clark until William Bobbitt. They all used the chair. In fact, we have a photograph in the collection of Chief Justice Stacy sitting in this chair in the conference room of the court. When the 3rd floor in this building was renovated in 1971 and 2, the old furniture was sent to state surplus along with this chair.
Yes.
And Senator Robert Morgan's wife, Katie, bought this chair at state surplus. And a few years ago, the senator called and said, listen, we need to put this chair there.
Yes.
And so we went and got it, and it's a valuable part of our collection.
I'm so glad we have it in our collection. Danny, we have 2 very interesting busts. I'd like to ask you to talk about those, please.
Sure. This is my good friend William Gaston. Gaston County is named for him, as well as Gastonia. As far as members of this court, he would rank probably in the top 5 members who've ever served on this court. He was the first student ever enrolled in Georgetown University. His family, as well as Justice Gaston, they were all very devout Catholic, and this bust was presented to the court along about 1890, best I can remember. He served on the court during a period of time when the Constitution of North Carolina said only people who believed in the true Protestant religion could serve as public officials. And there was a great debate because he was a Catholic, and that debate even involved Chief Justice John Marshall, who was our circuit justice here and actually held court just up the street here on the old Wake County Courthouse. But Justice Gaston wrote probably one of the more famous slave opinions in the entire South. It's a case called State v. Will. And I did this, and I did not know what I had done until I got to looking at it. Will who was a slave involved in this case, was owned by the Battle family in Edgecombe County, Justice Battle's family. And what happened, Will and his overseer became embroiled in a fight one day, and Will pulled out a knife and cut the overseer on his arm, and the overseer bled to death. And Will, of course, was charged with first-degree murder, and times being what they were, there was no great thought given to the outcome of the case. He was going to be found guilty, which he was. Murder conviction at that time carried an automatic sentence of death, and he was sentenced to be hanged. But the Battle family appealed to this court from the trial court, and the Bartholomew Moore here represented Will and the Battle family here to this court. And he argued to the court that a slave owner or an overseer had a right to chastise the slave, and the slave had to do what he told him to do, but the slave had a right to defend himself. And Justice Gaston, writing for a unanimous court, said that a slave had to obey his master. The master could, in fact, inflict punishment if the slave didn't obey him, but the slave had a right to defend himself if his life were threatened. And that's the first occasion that a court here in the United States had said such a thing.
Remarkable.
It was a remarkable decision
Indeed.
of its day. And John Marshall Harlan, in his dissent in Plessy, cited State v. Will. So it's a very famous case.
Very famous.
Very famous case. And we elected Justice Gaston, a very distinguished jurist.
How about the other bust?
This is a bust of William Preston Bynum, a very prominent Lincoln County family. He was a very wealthy attorney here in North Carolina. And his enduring legacy, he gave Bynum Hall over at UNC in honor of his grandson who was killed during the Civil War. A very distinguished jurist as well. And his family gave this about 1890 or so.
Danny, this is a very interesting collection on the west wall, First Ladies of the North Carolina Judiciary. A very important wall to me because I clerked for Judge Sharp as well as Judge Carlisle Higgins. She is a prominent part of this collection, along with a great many other very important and fine judges of North Carolina. Could you tell us about this wall?
Sure. We put this display up when we moved back into the Justice Building after the renovations. And because of the fact that we've got 3 women on the court now, I thought this would be a good display. And it's proven to be very, very popular with people coming in. And it represents the first woman ever appointed or elected to each of our courts here in North Carolina. And the first, of course, at the very beginning in 1949, we began with Chief Justice Susie Sharp, who was appointed to the Superior Court. She was Special Superior Court Judge. She was appointed by Governor Carr Scott. And surprisingly enough, there was a great deal of opposition to this appointment because a woman shouldn't be on the bench.
And why?
Because, well, one thing, a Greensboro editorialist wrote in his editorial that, and it explained the time at this point in our state history, when at a trial, when a particular brutal murder or a case involving some sort of sexual misconduct was carried on, women of the courtroom were invited to leave the courtroom because women weren't supposed to hear that kind of thing. And the editorialist in Greensboro wrote in his editorial, well, what will a lady judge do when she has to try a rape case? And Judge Sharp said she took pen in hand and wrote the newspaper gentleman and told him that since you could not have had a rape in the very beginning without a woman being present, it would be eminently satisfying to have one there on the payoff. So that was Judge Sharp.
I can hear her saying
Yes.
she took pen in hand. Incidentally, before we move on, can you tell us about this robe?
Sure. This is the robe Justice Sharp used while she was Chief Justice here. And you'll notice the collar here, and that indicates her feminine side. And as you can tell, she was a very petite lady, and she used this robe all the while she was Chief Justice here.
Yes.
And it's part of our collection here at the court.
How about the other marvelous women who have served in the judiciary?
Sure. We had at one time what they called Domestic Relations Court, and they heard juvenile delinquency cases. If you didn't go to school, you could actually be delinquent at that point in our history. And Memory Farmer, who's Memory Mitchell now, and actually Memory's still alive. She lives here in Raleigh, and she was the first woman appointed to that court. And it was each county or a large city could have one if they developed it on their own, and then the county commissioners would appoint one of these judges. And Judge Mitchell was telling me that the way it worked, the court was composed of herself and the clerk, and then the various people would come in. And the authority of that time was that she could sentence a man, most of the time it was a man, up to jail for 2 years. And the way it worked, she said if she had to do it, she would sentence a man to jail, say the Wake County Jail, for 2 years or 6 months. And she would tell him, says, listen, we're going to sentence you to 6 months in the Wake County Jail. And if you could, just go outside and have a seat in the hallway. I'll call the sheriff, and he'll send somebody over in a little bit to pick you up. But nobody ran off. They didn't lose anybody. Everybody just sat and waited for the sheriff. So times a little different now.
Times have certainly changed.
And she has written extensively about early legal education and the bar here in North Carolina, published in the North Carolina Historical Review. And of course, we come again to Susie Sharp when she was appointed to this court by Governor Terry Sanford in 1962. And this is her actual appointment from the governor. And this is what she looked like just about that time. And I think, Wade, you were here at the court when the famous baseball opinion
I did
she wrote.
Aren't you nice to mention that?
Yes.
I did the memorandum for Judge Sharp in the baseball case and baseball game. Well, she did, in fact, write an opinion about a baseball case. And the opinion dealt with the legal principle of causal connection. Remoteness, it was a negligence case, and what happened in the game, which was appealed to the Supreme Court, was that the manager of the Raleigh team would run out on the field and berate the umpire, and the fans would be just infuriated. And after the game was over, because the fans were so infuriated and so upset, a fan ran out onto the field and struck the umpire and hurt the umpire. So the umpire didn't sue the fan. The umpire sued the manager of the Raleigh team. Hence the connection issue, the causal relationship. Was it too remote? And I looked at every case in North Carolina history on causal connection, causal relationship, and remoteness, all the negligence cases, very interesting cases, and wrote a memorandum for the judge. And she agreed with me that it was too remote, if I may say, and she wrote an opinion that became very well known all across America that had a profound impact on baseball. And
I believe I remember reading that while y'all were at the game that you were at, a fight broke out, much like the one that the case was about.
I'm glad you mentioned that. The case was about a fight, and we went to a game between Raleigh and Greensboro, these professional teams, and a fight broke out at that game exactly like the one in the case that was appealed to the North Carolina Supreme Court. It was almost like I could not possibly have planned it any better. So it worked out really well, and she got to see a genuine baseball fight.
Yeah, and I think if the ruling had gone the other way, it would have sort of quelled fan participation in berating the umpire.
Well, yes, it would have. It would certainly have
squelched the game.
It would have been a damper on one of the best parts of baseball.
Exactly. Well, I'm glad we brought that up.
I'm glad you asked me that.
The next judge is Mary Widener. She was the first district court judge here in North Carolina. District courts were created in 1966, and I think they first heard cases in '67, and she was the first woman appointed to that office, and she ran for election after that. We next moved to Judge Naomi Morris, who was the first woman over at the Court of Appeals. It was created in 67 or 66, and then they first met, I believe, in the early part of 69. I believe you were telling me that Judge Morris was a legal secretary.
She was. She was a remarkable woman, and she was a legal secretary in a law firm in Wilson.
And her employer convinced her that she needed to go to law school, and she did, and this is her graduating photograph here with some of her classmates. And this is a collection her niece retained after her death, and surprisingly enough, it was down at the beach. And after I called, do you have anything about Judge Morris? And she had to search for it.
Yes.
And found all this wonderful things that we have here today. And of course, there is Judge Morris taking the oath of office in the Wilson County Courthouse with Judge Sharp administering the oath. And there's Governor Moore there. And this is Judge George Fountain.
Yes.
I'm sure you remember.
I remember him well. And I really like this photograph of the Court of Appeals with Judge Morris. And one of the reasons I like it is because it has Raymond Mallard, who is one of the most terrifying Superior Court judges I've ever seen. And lawyers just quaked in their boots when they entered Judge Mallard's courtroom. He was a remarkable judge, as was she. And she continued to be called Peanut, as I recall. Peanut Morris.
Some lawyers had to be terribly careful when they were arguing cases not to call her Peanut while she was on the bench. But we have just established the Raymond Mallard collection over at the Southern Collection at Chapel Hill. Mrs. Mallard and their daughter gave their papers and so forth. Very, very valuable set of papers. He presided over the Harriet Henderson textile strikes, which gained national news media here to North Carolina. He presided over that. Most of the sit-in strikes and one thing or another, Chapel Hill at the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, he presided all over there. And all of those papers were in his collection. He kept everything. I'm
so glad he did. He ran a very tight court, and he was the first trial judge I remember who had a bench book. That is, he had a very thick volume on his desk. He had a little brief of nearly every case that you could imagine a Superior Court judge would need to refer to. Other judges would call to get his views on legal points. A remarkable man, as was Judge Morris.
Yeah. Well, several other Superior Court judges copied Judge Mallard's bench book because it was most thorough.
Yes.
And after we received the bench books and other materials from Tabor City, we've actually had an attorney call at this date wanting to look at his bench book to see what it said.
Sure.
And we let him do it. It was there. And of course, this is Judge Britt here. David Britt was a most remarkable North Carolinian. He served as Speaker of the House, and probably he is credited mostly with creating the judicial system that we know today.
Yes.
Just a remarkable
amazing man. Yes, he was.
And Judge Britt served on the Court of Appeals. He also served on this court. And one of the most fascinating things to me, he never possessed a law degree.
I did not know that.
He
Very
attended
interesting.
Wake Forest and had to drop out and go back and help farm before he graduated.
Were there any other judges who did not have a law degree?
Judge Robert Martin over at the Court of Appeals was in the same situation. He went to Wake Forest and had to come back home and work. But they were both very eminent jurists.
Indeed they were.
The legal carryings on that we've just gone through to get our copy of the Bill of Rights back, the case that involved the letter of George Washington that escaped from our state archives, Judge Martin wrote the opinion of that, and that was the basis of the Attorney General's argument of us getting the Bill of Rights back, our copy back.
Yes.
So they may not have possessed a legal degree, but they were still good judges.
Yes, indeed they were. Danny, you mentioned that two of our fine judges were not graduates of a law school, Has that law been changed?
Yes, it was changed about the same time that we created the new judicial system, that before you could become a judge here, that you had to have at least passed the North Carolina bar. And then later on, the bar said before you could take the bar exam, you had to have a credited diploma from a law school. Right. So now you got to get out of law school. You got to get your degree and then take the bar before you become a judge here.
Yes. Well, we have Winifred Wells.
This is Weenie Wells, and she was the first woman resident Superior Court judge. Judge Sharp was always a special Superior Court judge. Weenie was appointed by Robert Scott, who was the son of Governor Carr Scott, who appointed our first woman judge, and Judge Robert Scott appointed Weenie Wells. And this, I think, is a remarkable photograph. This is Judge Wells taking the oath of office, and here we have Chief Justice Susie Sharp of the Supreme Court, Judge Naomi Morris of the Court of Appeals, and this is Judge John Larkins of the Federal Eastern District Court. So we have the Superior Court, Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, and the Federal Court all represented here in one photograph.
That is a remarkable photograph. 4
courts, and as far as I know, that's the only photograph that I know of that have 4 courts represented. And Judge Larkins was first cousin to Weenie's husband.
Okay.
So that's how, and this was actually done in the federal courthouse, her swearing in. Next we come to Susie Sharp as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. This photograph here, she's taking the oath of office up on the bench from Dr. I. Beverly Lake. The courtroom was absolutely packed that day because first woman Chief Justice and all that goes along with, and she was very popular, as you know.
Yes.
And here she is filing for office, so the Chief Justice here with all her male counterparts behind her. And they all supported her in her efforts to be elected. And if these are her license plates while she was Chief Judge here in 1975, and then after she retired, J1X. License plate's a little different now, but that's the way they were then.
I really like this photograph because it has the other judge for whom I clerked, Judge Carlisle Higgins, and that was a marvelous court.
Yes, that was a court.
It really was. This is an interesting photograph to me.
This is Chief Justice Sharp, of course, and Judge William Bobbitt, and this is Sarah Carter, Judge Bobbitt's daughter, and we all are familiar with the deep friendship between Judge Sharp and Judge Bobbitt.
It was one of the things that you enjoyed seeing if you were visiting the city of Raleigh. You would see them walking down the street together to lunch. It was a very happy scene to see.
Very warm friendship.
Yes.
And they called each other Judge.
Yes.
And they had an office here even after retired. They would come up in the morning. They would go to the Mecca, have breakfast, come here, read the paper, and then they would issue comments on the recent decisions of the court.
Yes. Yes.
And if you remember, the year Judge Sharp ran Chief Judge, her opponent that year was a fire extinguisher salesman from Bertie County.
Yes.
And
now, was that a close election? Sometimes we think, well, gosh, that was just a very close call. Was it a close call?
No. He got about 32% of the vote. Okay. And he was a Republican, and even Governor Holshouser, who was governor at the time, came out against it. Because he wasn't an attorney. He would have been absolutely lost here. And that changed the way we elect judges, that you had to be a lawyer before you're a judge here, and that changed all of that. But she won handedly in that election and served for a few years here. And this sort of reflects her career, beginning as a Superior Court judge, first year here as a judge on this court, and then just before she retired from the court.
A truly remarkable woman.
She was. She blazed a lot of ground in the legal profession here because she actually argued a case before this court. Her father in Reidsville says they were getting ready to come here, and he called her in one day, says, I want you to go to Raleigh tomorrow and argue this case before the high court. And she did, and I think she
Yes.
won. So, remarkable lady.
Indeed.
Remarkable
Yes, she
lady.
was.
And then we come to Judge Morris again as Chief Judge over at the Court of Appeals. And this she is receiving the oath of office from Chief Justice Sharp. And as you know, the Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals is appointed by the Chief Justice.
Yes.
And so Judge Sharp is administering the oath there, and the Court of Appeals, of course, is on the bench here. And this is one of the more remarkable things. This little girl named Anna wrote to Judge Morris after her election, and it says, "To Your Honor, Judge Peanut."
Yes.
So, and she talks about getting a puppy and so forth, and
Yes.
this is the only judge that she'd ever written to. So
Yes.
there's a little human touch there.
Indeed.
And as you see, even the newspaper still referred to her
As
Peanut,
on the bench. Yes. Tell us about Judge Hyatt.
Judge Hyatt was the first woman elected to the Superior Court here in North Carolina, and it took till 1986 for North Carolina to elect a resident woman Superior Court judge. And one of the things about this particular race, when she ran, Governor Hunt had appointed a fellow named Pantowski to fill out a term of the resident Superior Court judge there who had retired. And Judge Hyatt filed against him. Now, this was Haywood County, and there are not very many Pantowskis in Haywood County.
And I assume there were some Hyatts.
So there's a Hyatt Crossroads, there's a Hyatt Creek, everything Hyatt. So she had the upper hand in that
Yes,
election
yes.
just by name recognition. But as I understand, she's a very distinguished jurist, and I think now she's over in Paris singing opera.
Yes,
One of her
yes.
sidelines, so to speak.
Then we come to some women on the federal bench.
Yet we included the federal courts here because it's the first.
Yes.
And of course, Allison Duncan, the first woman from North Carolina on the Fourth Circuit, and here she's taking her oath of office.
Yes.
And of course, she's up on the bench there.
Indeed.
And then Judge Flanagan, Louise Flanagan, was the first woman federal judge here in North Carolina. And there, of course, she's taken the oath, and she is the chief district court judge.
Indeed. They are both
and they-
serving with great distinction
Yes, we think so.
as we speak. Danny, I had a job working in a typewriter shop when I was growing up in Albemarle, and we took typewriters just like this one apart and worked on them in the summer. Whose typewriter was this, and how old is it?
This typewriter belonged to Chief Justice Susie Sharp. She used it in 1962 when she first came to the court, and in 1975 she was still using this typewriter, and she took it with her and used it a while after she left the court, as I remember. And as you know, at this stage of the game here, opinions were typed and circulated on onion skin.
Yes, they were.
And she typed her own opinions, if you recall, and whoever the junior justice was had better have good eyes because it was going through 6 pages of carbon paper before you got that way.
Can you imagine what would happen if we took that up to one of the judges today and said we want to swap this for your computer?
Well, wait, I'll let you take it up. I'm not going up there.
Tell
but
us-
it
go
still,
ahead,
it still
I'm sorry.
works.
Yes.
And there's some white out all over it, so
Wow.
but, people are amazed that she still uses it, even though computers, whether she's stuck by this typewriter.
It's a long journey back to that.
Yes.
This is a very attractive mirror. Can you tell us about it?
Of course, this is a peer mirror, and it was a gift to the court from Chief Justice Sharp after the renovations in 1972. She felt there should be a mirror in the conference room of the court, and she found this, and the only thing she would say, it came from an old Raleigh family.
Okay, yes, it's
And that's
beautiful.
the only thing we know about it. But it's a beautiful mirror. It's period. It's about 1840 to 50 or so. And it's held its own very well through the years. And it was in the conference room of the court until the court current renovations, and we were trying to decide what to do with it. And this was a very, very appropriate place to have it.
Thank you especially for telling us about the marvelous women on the bench. We'll come back to Judge Parker in a few minutes, but I wanted to turn to some photographs now on the south wall. We have 4 very interesting photographs here. Could you talk about those?
Sure. These 4 photographs represent the 4 different courts that have had women Chief Justices, beginning, of course, with Chief Justice Sharp, then Chief Justice Rhoda Billings, and then the 2 different courts with Chief Justice Parker. This photograph was made, of course, in the conference room of the court, and sadly enough, all but Justice Exum here have died since this was made, and this was made in the courtroom.
Yes.
This was made over in the Senate chamber at the Capitol. The court met there to hear oral argument while this building was being renovated. And of course, the Senate chamber was no stranger to judicial proceedings. Sure. Governor Holding's impeachment trial was held in that room, as well as the Klan trials during Reconstruction were held in this room. So sort of like going back home. And this was our current court, and this photograph is made up in the courtroom.
Yes. These are beautiful photographs and remind us again of the quality of people we have had as our judges. Of course, one of my favorites is Judge Branch, a wonderful photograph of Judge Branch, as well as Judge Moore and Judge Copeland. Judge Lake is in that photograph. These are beautiful.
Well, these were gentlemen judges, as we know.
Yes.
And Judge Branch, I think, was everybody's favorite judge.
And lady judges.
Yeah, exactly.
And lady judges, yes. Could I ask you to come over and let me point out a clock?
Sure.
I want to learn something about. Danny, this is one of my favorite objects in the collection, and it is doing us the honor of striking as we see it. Can you tell us about this clock?
Sure. This clock was purchased for the office of the Chief Justice in 1914, and it remained in the chambers of the Chief Justice until we moved back in this building just about 6 years ago. And it keeps perfect time. Even though it's as old as it is, it still keeps perfect time. I rely on it more than I do my watch.
Well, I would assume then that we know it's exactly 11 o'clock. It's 11 o'clock. I want to ask you especially about this couch because it is described as a fainting sofa. I assume that back in that time people fainted, whereas we don't do that anymore, and we had to have couches close by to catch us as we fall. Can you tell us about the fainting sofa?
Well, this sofa was made in 1914 when the court moved into what we call the Ruffin Building across Febler Street. Each chamber had one of these sofas. It was a 5-member court at that time. And gentlemen of the day took naps at 3 o'clock. And they used these sofas to take naps. And we know where 2 of them are. 2 of them are here in the building. One is up in the chamber, and we have this one. For some reason, this was left in the Ruffin Building in 1940.
Yes.
And it survived. Now, how it survived, I don't know, but it did. And Judge Martin called a little bit ago and asked me if I wanted it over here, and of course I snapped it right up.
Of course.
And
what an interesting artifact. This document appears to be a law license, and it would seem to be even older than my law license. And maybe it's the oldest law license in North Carolina. Can you tell us about it?
Sure. This is the law license of William R. Davie, of course, who founded the University of North Carolina. It's 1779. And this is, in fact, the oldest law license that I know anything about.
Yes.
It was signed by the 3 judges at that time. And these 3 judges here composed the entire judiciary of North Carolina.
Wow.
At the time. These judges also were the 3 judges who decided the Baird v. Singleton case.
Yes.
One of the more important cases in
course.
American jurisprudence. And we're very proud of that. And on the reverse of this document, we have a order of the court signed by members of the court, Walter Clark being Chief Justice, that this law license is always to be housed in this building.
Yes.
And I'm not going to disobey an order of the court,
No,
so we're going
wouldn't.
to keep it right here. But it's an extraordinary thing that, first of all, it has existed this long.
Yes, it is indeed. it's a very important document. Danny, I'd like to return again to the subject of portraits. We have such a magnificent collection of portraits. Tell us about this portrait, please.
This is George Davis of Wilmington. Before the Civil War, he had a very prominent practice there in Wilmington. During the war, he was named the last Attorney General of the Confederacy. He was in Richmond when Richmond fell and actually left Richmond on the presidential train with the cabinet and the president. And then they traveled to Danville and Greensboro and then to Charlotte. And when they got to Charlotte, of course, we know that President Jefferson Davis wanted to continue fighting the war. And George Davis here is actually credited with convincing President Jefferson Davis that there was no need. It would just result in
more
loss of life, and there was just no. And he's actually credited with ending the war. He spent about 60 days in a federal prison. He was captured, and then after he was released, he returned to Wilmington and resumed his practice. He was in practice with the Bellamy family, represented railroads at that point in time. And if you go down Market Street today, and the statue in the middle of Market Street, that's George Davis.
I remember seeing that.
The members of the UDC erected that statue there.
I want to ask you about some other portraits. Danny, I wanted to ask you about this collection of portraits in what is called the lawyer's room. And you had indicated to me earlier that you did have a collection of portraits of lawyers, people who were not judges. We're in the lawyer's room now, and I wanted to ask you about these portraits.
These are, in fact, lawyers who have served here in North Carolina. Before the renovation, there were judges here in the lawyer's room, but I thought, what's the lawyer's room? Let's put lawyers.
Yes.
And this is just three of our collection of lawyers who are represented here at the court. They're representing some very prominent law firms still in existence.
Yes.
Rise and Bennett, who was a 19th century attorney here in North Carolina, very prominent attorney. People know him now, but they will recognize the Spruill name.
Yes, Frank Spruill.
This is Frank Spruill. He's represented here in the collection, and then Mr. Fuller as well.
Yes.
The Fuller Law Firm. And these
Williamson Fuller.
Yes.
Yes.
And these are just part of the entire portrait collection, and we've got quite a few more attorneys up in the library of the court.
Since we're so close to the Supreme Court room, it would be a real treat if we could just peep in there. Could we do that?
Oh, sure. Now, you understand that lawyers wait here sometimes to go out and do battle.
I understand.
And just through that door is the courtroom.
Ah.
So let's walk out there.
Can you take us through there?
Sure.
Danny, this is probably the most beautiful room in North Carolina. Can you tell us about it?
This is the courtroom of the Supreme Court. The court has been meeting in this room for oral arguments since 1940. And surprisingly enough, this room has remained unchanged. The same furniture, the same books, everything is the same that was in 1940. Now, the portraits here in the courtroom are the former Chief Justices of the court, beginning with John Lewis Taylor, who was our first in 1819, and Chief Justice Joseph Branch was the last chief presented here to the court, and including Justice Walter Stacey here, who is the longest serving Chief Justice we've had here on the court.
There is a very large painting up at the west end of this room, and it hangs over the chairs the judges occupy during oral argument. Could you tell us about that painting?
And now this is the portrait of Chief Justice Thomas Ruffin, one of the 10 eminent common law jurists in the United States history. He served here on the court as Chief Justice, and then actually he came back and served 18 months as an associate, which would have been unheard of in today's times. But that was presented to the court in 1888. It was the first portrait presented to the court by his daughter, who was a daughter of married Paul Cameron, who was the richest man in North Carolina of that period. Justice Ruffin is still quoted with authority in many cases, and he's one of the few American judges that's been quoted with authority in Westminster Hall.
I wanted to ask you also about the clock, the beautiful clock over on the south end of the building, of the room. Is this clock used in oral argument? That is it in operation during oral argument when lawyers are actually presenting their cases here?
Oh yes, this clock normally is kept running 24 hours a day. It was made for the court in 1914 when the court moved into the Ruffin building, and it was brought over here when the court moved here in 1940. The casework was made here in Raleigh, and the works were made in New York and shipped down. But it does gong during oral argument, and which throws some attorneys off a little bit.
Yes.
But, it runs during oral argument, and you can actually hear it gong.
Danny, while we're on this floor, I must ask you about one other painting, and that is this marvelous painting of Senator Ervin. This
is, in fact, Senator Sam Ervin, or as we know him here in this building, Justice Ervin.
Yes.
He served here on the court, and he sat as junior justice, as all junior justices do, and then, of course, went on to United States Senate and
yes.
served with very great distinction there. And he's probably one of the best representatives North Carolina's ever had.
A marvelous North Carolinian.
Yes.
No doubt.
Love this state above all. And we're very proud to have. This was done about the time he was in the Senate as
yes.
opposed to the time he was here on the court.
I want to ask you about a couple of other things. Danny, I wanted to ask you about these portraits. These are portraits of Supreme Court justices. Why are they not in the main courtroom?
Well, as I said, the courtroom contains the portraits of the Chief Justices. Associate Justices' portraits are hung here in the hallway. And all of these are former Associate Justices of the court.
I see Justice Lake.
Justice Ivory Lake
Justice
Sr.
Britt.
Judge Britt,
Judge
Copeland,
Judge Webb.
Judge Sewell.
Yes.
And then at the far end of the hall is Robert A. Douglas, who was the grandson of Stephen A. Douglas.
Oh, yes.
Who debated Lincoln.
Right.
The Douglas family settled in Greensboro.
Danny, the energy behind this documentary project that we're doing came from our current Chief Justice, and I wanted to wait until the last part of our documentary to talk about her. Would you talk about Judge Sarah Parker?
Chief Justice Parker was the first woman to serve on both the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court, and she was also the first woman elected to the Supreme Court without first having been appointed to the court. And she has broken a lot of ground, as well as the other women who came before her in the judiciary here in North Carolina.
Yes.
And we included her here because she is the current Chief Justice, and she was the first woman ever elected to both of our courts, our appellate courts here.
And in keeping with our North Carolina tradition, someday her portrait will hang in the main gallery or chambers for the Supreme Court.
It will be placed in the courtroom. We have currently 5 retired Chief Justices, and places are being held for each of their portraits. And we know exactly where Chief Justice Parker's will go.
Danny, there's one last thing I wanted to ask you about. So
sure.
Let's walk back over to the other side of the room. Danny, we would be remiss if we didn't mention this plaque. Tell us about it. This
is the plaque who actually names all of this collection. The collection is the Charles F. Blanchard Historical Collection. It's named in honor of Charlie Blanchard, an attorney here in Raleigh, whom we all know. Charlie was the first elected president of the North Carolina Supreme Court Historical Society. Charlie's law firm, the ones he's associated with now, raised the funds to do all of this, and everything in this room was done with private funds, and they raised that money, and Charlie has started at least 4 law firms that I can remember.
Yes.
Just a marvelous, marvelous man, and we thought that honoring him in this way would be the best way that we could honor our first president and reflect what goes on here in this room. Well, I'm so glad that this plaque is here, and what a gift to North Carolina. Yes, to the entire state. Yes. Thank you very much, Danny, for taking us on this tour. Glad to have you.